The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the winding country road. I sat in the passenger seat of our old faithful SUV, watching the trees blur into a darkening smear as Sarah drove. We'd been on this camping trip for a week already, exploring the most remote spots of the wilderness, far from the hum of city life. It was peaceful, liberating even. Just the two of us, our tent, and the vast untouched woods. But tonight, something felt different. The road was emptier than usual. We hadn't seen another car for miles. The gas gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty, and I could see the worry flickering across Sarah's face, though she tried to hide it. "We'll need to stop soon," I said, breaking the silence. She nodded, gripping the wheel tighter. "I saw a sign for a gas station a few miles back. We'll stop there." We drove in silence for another 10 minutes before a small, dimly lit gas station appeared in the distance. The building looked like it had been standing there for decades, weathered and tired, its faded sign barely legible. The only light came from a single flickering bulb above the entrance, casting long, eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. I couldn't help but feel uneasy as we pulled up to one of the rusted pumps. An old man shuffled out from inside the station. His clothes were tattered, his skin leathery from years under the sun, and his eyes were wild. They darted around, never quite settling on us, as though he was looking at something just beyond our shoulders. "Need a fill-up?" he rasped, his voice like sandpaper on stone. "Yeah," Sarah replied, stepping out of the car. "We're running low." As he started pumping the gas, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I glanced around, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. "You two out here camping?" the old man asked, breaking the silence. "Yeah, just taking a trip through the woods," Sarah said, forcing a smile. She was better at small talk than I was. The old man grunted, his gaze finally settling on me, his eyes narrowed. "You're not planning on camping near Blackwood Ridge, are you?" I frowned. "We weren't planning on it. Why?" "Good," he said quickly, his voice lowering to a whisper. "Folks disappear up there. Their tents found torn to shreds. Like a bear got 'em, but no bears in these parts. Haven't been for years." Sarah laughed nervously, but the sound felt hollow in the stillness of the night. "I'm sure we'll be fine. Probably just some coyotes, right?" The old man shook his head, his wild eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Coyotes don't leave claw marks like that. Deep ones. Circling around the camp. Whatever's out there, it ain't natural." Sarah exchanged a glance with me, her smile faltering. But we both dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man who'd probably spent too much time alone in the woods. We paid for the gas, thanked him, and got back in the car, eager to put some distance between us and the eerie gas station. As we drove off, I could feel the old man's eyes on us until we were swallowed by the night. We found a clearing a few miles up the road, near the very ridge the old man had warned us about. Despite the warning, the spot was perfect. Secluded, quiet, with a view of the stars that stretched on forever. We set up our tent and built a small fire, laughing about the old man's tale. "He probably just wants to keep people away so he can have the whole place to himself," Sarah said, poking at the fire. "Yeah, I'm sure we'll be fine," I agreed, though the unease from earlier still lingered at the back of my mind. The night was still. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the distant hoot of an owl. But as we crawled into our sleeping bags, a heavy silence settled over the campsite. The kind of silence that presses on your ears, making you hyper-aware of every small noise. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the trees, but then I heard it again. A soft scratching, like claws dragging against fabric. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah stirred beside me, half asleep. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. She nodded, wide-eyed now, both of us straining to listen. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate, as though something was circling the tent. And then, something heavy brushed against the side of the tent, causing the fabric to bulge inward. "Turn on the flashlight," I hissed. Sarah fumbled for the light, her hands shaking. When the beam finally cut through the darkness, we saw deep claw marks gouged into the ground just outside the tent. They circled our camp, crisscrossing in erratic patterns, as though something had been stalking us. "What the hell?" I muttered. my blood running cold. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night, too terrified to move, our ears tuned to every rustle, every snap of a twig. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we were already packing up, desperate to leave. But when we reached the car, our hearts sank. All 4 tires had been slashed, the rubber shredded as if something with enormous claws had raked through them. Panic set in. We were miles from the nearest town, stranded with no cell service and no way to drive out. "We'll have to walk," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "There's got to be a town nearby." We grabbed our backpacks and started down the road, the dense forest pressing in on either side. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the woods themselves were watching us. After what felt like hours of walking, we finally stumbled upon a small town. It was a quiet place, the kind where everyone knows each other. We approached the first person we saw, an old woman sitting on her porch, knitting. "Excuse me," I said. "We broke down near Blackwood Ridge. We need help." We stopped at a gas station a few miles back, but... The woman's eyes snapped up, her face pale. "Gas station? There hasn't been a gas station near Blackwood Ridge for over 20 years. It burned down after the owner disappeared. People say he wandered up into those woods and never came back." I felt a chill run down my spine. "But we were just there last night. The old man, he filled our tank." She shook her head, her expression grave. "You must be mistaken. No one's been up there in years. Not after what happened." Sarah and I stood there, stunned, the realization sinking in like a lead weight. The gas station, the old man, it wasn't possible. We turned to leave, but as we did, the woman called after us, her voice barely a whisper. "If you were up near Blackwood Ridge, you're lucky to be alive." We never went back to retrieve the car. We left the woods behind, but the memory of that night, the scratching, the claw marks, the impossible encounter with the long-gone gas station still haunts us. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear the scratching at the edge of my dreams. We were never much of a camping family, to be honest. My wife, Laura, preferred the comforts of home, and our teenage daughter, Emily, was more interested in her phone than the great outdoors. But after months of being cooped up in the city, I insisted we needed a break. A weekend in the wilderness would do us good, reconnect us as a family. That's how we found ourselves driving deep into the woods, farther than we had ever gone before. I'd done my research, found a remote campsite in a national forest, far away from the bustle of life. It sounded perfect. Just the 3 of us, no distractions, and nothing but nature. We arrived just before dusk, setting up our tent in a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the distant chirping of crickets and the gentle rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, like the world had suddenly gone quiet. That first night, after we settled in and the fire died down, we all crawled into the tent, wrapped in the silence of the forest. I was just about to drift off when I heard it. A soft sound, faint, barely audible but unmistakable, crying. It sounded like a child, maybe a young girl, sniffling and sobbing somewhere far off in the woods. I held my breath, listening carefully. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was an animal, or the wind playing tricks on my ears. But as the minutes passed, the crying continued, a soft, mournful sound that seemed to rise and fall with the breeze. I sat up, glancing at Laura, who was already fast asleep. Emily was curled up in her sleeping bag, oblivious to the noise. I strained my ears, listening again. But after a while, the sound faded, and the forest returned to its quiet, still state. I convinced myself it had been nothing, just the strange acoustics of the wilderness, amplifying some distant noise. I didn't want to overreact and ruin our first night. So I pushed the thought away and eventually fell asleep. The next day was uneventful. We hiked, cooked over the campfire, and spent the evening watching the stars come out. Emily was in surprisingly good spirits, laughing with her mother as they toasted marshmallows, and I felt a rare sense of peace settle over us. Maybe this trip was exactly what we needed. But that night, things changed. We were huddled inside the tent again when the crying returned. This time, it was louder, more distinct, and there was no mistaking it. The sound of a young girl somewhere in the woods, crying softly, her voice carrying through the trees like a ghostly whisper. Laura stirred beside me, her eyes fluttering open. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah, I heard it last night too." She sat up, frowning. "It sounds like a child. Is there someone out there?" I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. The forest loomed around me, dark and silent, save for the occasional creak of branches. I shone the light into the trees, scanning the perimeter of our camp, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of life. The crying continued, though, faint but persistent. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the woods like it was bouncing off the trees. I walked around the campsite, calling out, "Hello? Is someone out there? Are you okay?" But no one answered. The crying stopped abruptly, as if the girl had heard me and was now hiding, waiting in the shadows. I stayed out there for a while, listening, my skin prickling with unease. But after a few minutes of silence, I gave up and went back inside the tent. Laura looked at me, her face pale. "Did you find anything?" she asked. "No," I said, shaking my head. "Nothing. Maybe it's an animal or the wind." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The third night was worse. By now, Emily had picked up on our unease. She wasn't saying much, but I could tell she was scared. She spent most of the day glued to our side, casting nervous glances at the trees as if expecting something to come out of the woods at any moment. We tried to reassure her, but the tension in the air was thick, impossible to ignore. That night, the crying started almost as soon as we got into the tent. This time, it was right outside. It was louder, more insistent, the sound of a girl sobbing uncontrollably just beyond the thin fabric of our tent. I could hear her gasping for breath between the cries, her voice trembling with fear. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging through me. Emily sat bolt upright, clutching her sleeping bag. "Dad, I saw her," she whispered, her voice shaking. My blood ran cold. "Saw who?" "The girl," she said, her eyes wide with terror. She was standing by the trees, watching us. Laura gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What? When?" "Just now," Emily said, her voice barely audible. "I saw her through the tent. She was crying." I didn't wait. Grabbing the flashlight, I threw open the tent flap and stepped out into the night. The air was thick, oppressive, and the woods seemed darker than ever. I scanned the trees, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the shadows, but I saw nothing. No movement, no figures, just the empty forest as still and silent as a graveyard. The crying stopped again, leaving only the sound of my own breathing, ragged and uneven. I turned back to the tent, my heart racing. "We're leaving," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and frustration. "We're not staying here another night." Laura didn't argue. We packed up in silence, too scared to speak, the weight of the night pressing down on us like a heavy fog. By the time we got into the car and drove away, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon, but it brought no comfort. The crying still echoed in my mind, haunting and relentless. We didn't talk about it much after that. Life returned to normal, and we tried to forget about the strange events in the woods. But the memory lingered, a dark shadow that hung over us, never fully fading. Months later, I was sitting on the couch, flipping through the channels, when a news story caught my attention. Several families, camping in the same area where we had stayed, had reported hearing the sound of a young girl crying at night. Some claimed to have seen her, standing at the edge of their campsites, watching them with wide, sad eyes. Others described hearing her voice calling out for help, only for the sound to vanish the moment they stepped outside. No one had ever found her. No one knew who she was or where the crying came from. I stared at the screen, a chill running down my spine. It wasn't just us. We weren't imagining it. And then, late one night, I heard it again. The soft, distant sound of a young girl crying, coming from somewhere deep in the woods behind our house. The forest was supposed to be our escape, a long overdue break from the chaos of everyday life. We were a group of 5, me, Jack, Emma, Dylan, and Laura, friends since college, each of us more than ready for a weekend of campfires, starry skies, and laughter deep in the wilderness. No cell phones, no work, no distractions. Just us and the endless stretch of trees that loomed like sentinels as we drove further into the woods. We found the perfect spot, miles from the nearest town. It was remote, isolated, The kind of place where it felt like the world had forgotten you. That first night was everything we'd hoped it would be. The air was cool, the sky blanketed with stars, and the fire crackled between us as we shared stories and roasted marshmallows. There was no sound but the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustling of the wind through the trees. We went to bed without a care in the world, tucked into our sleeping bags, the fire dying down to embers. It was peaceful, tranquil. A kind of quiet you can only find when you're miles from civilization. But that peace didn't last. It was Dylan who first noticed it on the second night. We'd been sitting around the fire again, laughing and talking, when he went quiet, his gaze locked on something just beyond the tree line. "Do you guys see that?" he whispered, pointing into the darkness. We all turned, following his line of sight. There, just barely visible between the trees, was a pair of glowing eyes. At first, we thought it was an animal. It had to be, right? Some kind of deer, maybe, or a raccoon. The eyes stared at us for a long moment before disappearing into the night, leaving us a little unsettled but not overly concerned. We joked about it being a wild animal and moved on. But something about the way those eyes had watched us made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The third night, the eyes were back. Closer this time. Jack was the one who saw them first, and by then, the unease had started to settle into our bones. The fire flickered, casting strange shadows on the trees, and those glowing eyes seemed to reflect the light, hovering just out of reach. "It's probably nothing," Emma said, her voice unsteady. "An animal, like before." "Then why is it getting closer?" Jack muttered, keeping his gaze fixed on the tree line. No one had an answer for that. We all tried to brush it off, but something about the way those eyes lingered, like they were watching us, made it impossible to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, when we crawled into the tent, the air felt different, heavier. The fire outside had burned down to a faint glow, and the forest around us was too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, trying to force my mind to quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first I thought it was Emma or Laura talking in their sleep, but as I listened, I realized the voice was coming from outside the tent. It was faint, soft, barely more than a breath, but I could hear it. My name, whispered over and over again. "Jason?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was the kind of fear that makes you feel cold all over, that primal, gut-wrenching terror that something is very, very wrong. I strained to hear more, but the whispering stopped as suddenly as it had started. In the morning, I told the others what I'd heard. Jack paled. "I heard the same thing," he said. "Someone whispering my name. I thought I was imagining it." The mood shifted after that. The light-heartedness from the first night was gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread that none of us could shake. We decided to pack up and leave, but as we started gathering our things, Dylan let out a startled cry. "Guys, come look at this." He was standing at the edge of the camp, staring at a tree. Carved into the bark was a strange symbol, something I'd never seen before. It looked almost like a rune, jagged lines intersecting in strange patterns. As we moved from tree to tree, we realized the same symbol was carved into several of them, surrounding our camp in a tight circle. "What the hell is this?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. "Someone's messing with us," Jack said. "They've been watching us this whole time." We agreed to leave that afternoon, no longer willing to stay another night. But something about those symbols made me feel like it was already too late, like whatever had marked our camp had already staked its claim. We tried to sleep one last time before setting off at dawn, though none of us really managed to rest. Every little sound outside the tent set my heart racing, and I kept picturing those glowing eyes just beyond the trees, waiting. Around 3 a.m., I heard the zipper. It was slow, deliberate, the metal teeth separating one by one with a soft hiss. I bolted upright, adrenaline surging through me, and saw Jack doing the same. "Did you?" he started, but I silenced him with a look. The zipper was moving, unzipping from the outside. My heart thundered in my ears as I grabbed the flashlight, flicking it on and pointing it toward the tent flap. It was still halfway unzipped, the outside world dark and silent. There was no one there. We sat in terrified silence for what felt like hours, waiting for something to burst through the tent. but nothing came. Eventually, I zipped the tent back up, my hands shaking, and we spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening for any sound. When dawn finally broke, we crawled out of the tent, bleary-eyed and on edge. That's when we saw the footprints. They were everywhere, circling the camp in a wide arc. Muddy, barefoot prints, much larger than any of ours, like someone had been pacing around the tent all night, watching, waiting. No one left the tent, Laura said, her voice trembling as she stared at the prints. I felt sick, my stomach twisting into knots. We need to leave, now. We packed up in record time, not bothering to eat or even put out the fire completely. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind made us jump. The forest, once serene and beautiful, now felt like it was closing in on us, suffocating. The glowing eyes, the whispers, the symbols, they all blurred together in my mind, forming a horrifying mosaic of dread. As we hiked back to the car, the sun rising higher in the sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every so often, I'd glance back and catch a glimpse of movement between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. A shadow, a flicker of something that shouldn't be there. We reached the car by midday, the sight of it a welcome relief. As we piled in and sped away, none of us spoke. The tension was thick, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires. When we finally reached town, the first thing I did was look for a place with cell service. I had to know what those symbols meant, what we had encountered out there. After a bit of searching, I found a local historian who specialized in old folklore. When I showed him a photo of the symbol, his face went pale. "You need to stay away from those woods," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "That symbol, it's a marker. It means you were watched, chosen." "Chosen?" I asked, my mouth dry. He nodded, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. "Whatever you saw out there, whatever followed you, it wasn't done with you yet." I didn't know what to say. We left the historian's office in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a vice. Even now, months later, I still feel like I'm being watched. At night, when I close my eyes, I hear the zipper, slowly opening, and I know that whatever followed us from those woods isn't finished with us yet.